So as coaches, we're always seeking growth. We're always trying to get better. Books and podcasts, they're great, but they don't know your specific challenge in your moment. You need more. You need mentors in the trenches. That's why we're launching the Coach Gym, an online community designed for you. Get full access to all our online courses, hundreds of digital resources for team building and culture, plus step into a global community with direct access to myself, Nate Sanderson, and other experts through webinars and weekly office hours. Learning is a journey. We want you in on it. Join the Coach Gym today. Visit tocculture.com. That's tocculture.com. So probably the most powerful mindset shift I've ever experienced as a coach was when I stopped seeing athlete emotional dysregulation, like them blowing up, getting angry, shutting down, fighting, or throwing a tantrum. When I stopped seeing that as a problem and I started seeing it as an opportunity. Now, let me give you an example from parenting. So when I offer my 3 kids a cookie last night, each of them, and they get into a big fight over who gets the biggest one, my parenting brain, my dysregulated parenting brain instantly goes to, I cannot believe them. They are ungrateful, spoiled kids. I offer them a cookie and they're so stinking selfish that they're over there fighting over whose cookie is 3 grams heavier than the others, right? Now, I didn't let that thought hang there very long. Obviously, I took a deep breath. I looked at how cute my kids were and reflected on how grateful I am to be a dad, right? I applied all of David Durand's tools from last episode. And I made that shift, that, hey, this is an opportunity to help my kids learn gratitude and learn how to share. Listen, I don't always make that shift, but when I do, as a parent or as a coach, I can just assure you it is an incredibly powerful mindset shift. And I know when I started to make that as a coach, I was able to be a lot more regulated and intentional with my athletes when they were emotionally triggered. I was able to get curious, right? Like, hey, what's going on here? And how can I help this person? How can I help this situation? What's the learning opportunity in this? And it's the same that you try to make with your kids in parenting, right? As you do in coaching. It's just such a powerful shift, right? Rather than seeing these misbehaviors as problems, seeing what's the opportunity in this? What's the learning opportunity? How can I help them? Now, in today's conversation, it's the second part of our conversation with David Durand. We're going to really unpack how we can master our own nervous system and then help our athletes to do the same as well. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nerman, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Betsy Butterick. The mission of this podcast is to help you to become a better leader and build a better team culture. To get the notes to this in every episode of the podcast, all you need to do is subscribe to the Team Culture Toolbox. It's the TOC weekly newsletter. There's a link in the details of this episode, or you can do so at tocculture.com. Also, check out Betsy's blog on Substack at Betsy Butterick. I had a couple questions here. One around this unwilling and unable, and okay, are they unwilling or are they unable?
Right.
And there's some of the things that in your stuff there we talked about, like there's a level of demanding, and I kind of want to be demanding as a coach, and I want to communicate that, hey, you may not feel like you're able, and maybe even your parents don't feel like you're able, but I really feel like you're well able to do this.
Yeah.
But I'm with you. I'm here. I'm supportive, but challenging and stretching. I think one of the big pushbacks we get around from coaches around some of these things is, that, well, when they leave our team and our program, is their boss going to be really worried about their polyvagal system here that much,
Sure.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, like, how can we know when they're unable? Is there a way to know that? And then, how do we help encourage them to be a little bit more able? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. And I'll answer that more directly, but I think it's attached to what I get from coaches the most is like, oh, so you're saying, we need to, that's just them being soft, right? I hear that all the time. It's just them being soft, that player's being soft. And so I love the kind of tree analogy there too, of just like the nervous system. When we talk about resilience, we're talking about the nervous system. The nervous system is resilience. And so resilience being this nervous system is going to get thrown off, but can it find its way back to that center, to that balance, to that connection mode? And so when we think of like a tree, if a tree is like overly rigid and it's not well rooted, then that storm's going to come and it's going to snap. But if a tree, it has a ton of give to it and it's not, kind of well rooted, it's gonna bend and kind of topple over. The wind's just gonna kind of blow it down. So it needs to kind of strike this balance between like rigidity. It needs to have some rigidity and form and structure to it, but it also needs to be able to bend too, right? Like a pine tree. And so if it's well rooted and grounded, it has that stability, and then it can kind of take the weather, take the storms, and always find its way back to kind of that centerpiece. I think that's really what the nervous system is about, and being human and being an athlete and being a coach. And that's what we're trying to foster in these programs and organizations and for athletes, is to be able to be resilient, to have a nervous system that can face adversity, face challenges, and find its way back to that centerpiece and then be stronger because of it and more well rooted and grounded. So, how to do that? Because there's this kind of distinction between, okay, are they unwilling or unmotivated, or are they unable? What's going on here? And so I think it's first about finding that connection mode, finding that center of helping them become regulated, and then seeing what they're capable of when they're regulated, and then starting to push the boundaries there, because it's a difference between like stretching and stressing. So stretching, an athlete, and calling them into that space of really stretching them, like that's what coaching is about. That's what sports are about. That's why we're here. That's why this podcast exists. That's why all this exists, because we're stretching that comfort zone. We're expanding possibilities for athletes, not just in the sports world, but as they go on into their lives. So the stronger their relationship to connection mode, the stronger their nervous system, the greater they can stretch. And that's every human, right? The better our ability to be resilient, the more we can do, the more we can face challenges, face the world, go out and really, do great things. And so it's really about building that center, that relationship to connection mode. And so making sure that we can help athletes get into that place, and then from that place challenge them beyond it and try and kind of push the boundaries. But a lot of times where people go wrong is when athletes are already dysregulated and we're not putting efforts into helping them regulate, and then we start challenging them, and then we start stressing them, and then that's just all you're doing is stacking. You're just stacking things on top of the other 40 things they already have that you don't know about, that might be a big deal to them, but maybe not so much to you or anybody else. And so I think that's the reality, is helping them regulate first and then challenging from there. So we're stretching them and not just, stressing a nervous system that is already stressed. So yeah, I would love to kind of riff on that some more, but yeah, I'll stop there. If you have, I would love follow-up question or kind of help me clean that up a bit.
I was gonna just offer support and say, we're nerds here, and selfishly, I'm like, "No, keep riffing. This is great," you know? But yeah, I think that you are making it very accessible for people to understand if this is new, if they're more familiar, it's still relevant and applicable. So, thank you for what you're offering.
And I want to thank you for saying that. And I want to say too, JP, like I love, so like demandingness is interesting. So I kind of come from a theory and philosophy of REBT, so rational emotive behavior therapy, and that's under CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And there's a great guy, Martin Turner, who's out of the UK, I believe, and he's applying that to sports. And so if coaches want to check out that work, Martin Turner, REBT, and what's he gets at there is that our beliefs about ourselves are so important. I know you talk about beliefs a lot, core beliefs, core values, like these things are super important, especially when building out a culture and helping athletes. And so that idea of demandingness, and I think on one hand, it's being able to call athletes forward into things that they wouldn't do themselves. And I think that's just human nature. We're going to shrink into our comfort zones. That's why we need community and other people to call us forward into greater places, into the unknown. And that's our role as coaches, I believe, and as educators. And so, calling people forward. And then there's like a demandingness piece. What I'm seeing a lot, and I think this is really important for coaches to understand, is that these athletes nowadays, Gen Z and beyond, they struggle so much with perfectionism, and that perfectionism is rooted in this demandingness. And it's a different demandingness than I think you're talking about, JP, as coaches and kind of calling them forward. But it's the demandingness of I have to be perfect. It's those words: I have to, I must, I need to, I can't, I should have, I ought. These words almost have like a morality to their language. And internally, when I'm working with athletes on the psychological side, it just starts to unravel. And I hear it day in and day out, where their self-talk and their beliefs is wrapped up in this demandingness of like, I have to be perfect, I can't miss a shot, right? And then we as coaches see that fear of failure. We see them start to play defensive, and we're wondering what's going on. And then we get frustrated and we kind of, lash out or stress them out more. And then it's this kind of vicious cycle. But I think really internally, it's a lot of demandingness that has been internalized by these athletes, and they've wrapped up so much of their identity within their performance, and that's really what I'm kind of seeing. So the demandingness as a coach, I think, can be that kind of helping them regulate and then calling them forward into greater challenges and greater potential. But I think that's a different demandingness than usually the ones that are inside of them.
No, I love that aspect of just calling them forward on that. The I mean, I just think about that unwilling versus unable, and just even my own daughter last night. We were playing a very competitive game of Rummy 500, and it's like almost 9 o'clock, and I knew she was just unable at that point to regulate her frustration over her brother taking one of her, poor discarded cards there that was going to cost her big time. But and so that was just kind of like, all right, we're done here, or you're done for the night. And it wasn't a combative thing. It wasn't trying to force things, but it's just accepting that, like, hey, we just sometimes don't have the resources. And I think sometimes even
Yeah.
as us as coaches, we have to accept, like, yeah, I'm not in the right place. I need to take a step back. I need to go get some rest. I need to get some sleep. I need to step away from the situation because I'm not going to be regulated enough to help these
Right.
athletes in this situation. I want to kind of come to this question around, as we kind of wrap it up here, is just this question around choice versus obligation. And I think this is something really that resonated with me in your work. You kind of emphasizing this with athletes, choice versus obligation, because I think gratitude is gratitude is a core value of mine. And I want people to feel like, oh, you chose to be here. We get to be here. And like, no, we don't have to be here, So I wonder if you could unpack choice versus obligation and just how that matters to in this psychological approach with Gen Z athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a big thing for Gen Z, and I think all humans is that sense of autonomy. And I think a lot of times, and I speak for myself too, right, on the cusp of Gen Z, but this describes me perfectly of wanting to act from my own place of desires rather than other people kind of pressing obligations or rules or regulations onto me. And I think I don't think I'm alone in that. I think a lot of people feel that way and think that way, and especially young athletes of like, they don't typically know what they want. And I think that's the biggest issue that we're fighting here. And I'll get kind of tie this into choice and obligation, but a lot of kids are growing up now and they don't know what they're interested in. Like they don't really have they do have these desires. They just don't know them or haven't really formulated them or really constructed them. And so I think, again, full circle comes back to where we started, of like that awareness piece of really getting that personal connection with players and understanding like what they want and what they desire. Because many frustrations that I see with coaches and myself is I want this player to be great, but maybe that player, on the team, like she's just there for social reasons. She just wants to hang out with Jenny and play some volleyball. And like they're just, they're pals and like that's it. And like that's awesome. But for me, I come at it just like, oh well, no, she has great potential. I want her to be the best. And it's like she's not like, she's just there to hang out and get a little bit better. Like she's there for different reasons, and she has different desires and dreams and goals. Like she's loves the violin and that's her thing. So there's just different things. It's like understanding players and their desires and really what they want, kind of in this big way, but then also specifically with sports and the team they're a part of. So I always think that's the biggest thing of really tapping into the desires of the individual and understanding what they want, because that speaks to why they're there and what they're going to really try and seek out of this experience of being part of a team, the season and whatnot. So then I think we can start to talk about that kind of choice and obligation distinction, because putting um, putting things in front of them that speak to those desires rather than us just saying, you're obligated to do this if you want to be a part of this team. Because even that's, transactional and conditional of like, if you want to be a part of this team or if you want to be a great player, you have to do this. Back to the kind of the demandingness. You have to do this. You ought to do this. It has that moral language rather than choice of like, hey, if you want to be a great player, hey, you want to have fun this season with your friends, whatever their desires are, like here are some ways that I found that have been really helpful, in kind of building out that culture, even specifically concretely with practice of understanding. Like one example could be a coach, say it's basketball, right? The day after like a tough game, and having them talk about what went wrong, and then kind of jotting down, right, a couple themes that they talk about. What could we do today to work on these things, right? And if there's crickets and no one's talking, then you start listing a couple options of like, hey, okay, and teams I've coached in the past or kind of my work or from my thought, like we could do this, this, and this. what do y'all think? Which one would y'all like to do? Like even just laying out options, letting them into that process, like I think is really important. So I'm all for choice versus obligation. At the same time, I understand the nuance there of challenging players, because if we just leave them to make their own choices, then the majority of the time they're probably going to stay in their comfort zone. So even understanding that the choices that we lay out as coaches can be choices that challenge them and choices that bring them out of themselves, and not always maybe choices that they would put forth themselves. And so, yeah, I think for us as coaches, one, understanding their desires and what they want, their reasons for being there, because odds are it's probably different than ours. And then two, really foster that sense of autonomy by laying out some choices and letting them make some decisions and kind of lead. And then also understanding that, hey, sometimes these choices they wouldn't kind of put forth these choices because they're challenging and tough, and that's the nature of being a coach and calling them forward, and at the same time still letting them kind of have some voice, activate their voice and their own journey of development and growth.
Yeah, and David, again, everything you're saying resonates. If there's one thing that I offer coaches in effectively working with Gen Z, it's this idea of co-creation. So co-creating the
Mhm.
environment, speaking to choices, giving opportunities for autonomy, and getting very specific as a coach
Yes.
about what are your negotiables and non-negotiables. And then when you're making your requests of athletes, let's say for some of those non-negotiables, even framing the language intentionally so that it's two choices, but both choices that are in alignment with what you need to
Yeah.
happen or what's going to benefit the athlete. Let me ask you this. When you're talking about choices they wouldn't make on their own, and we're talking about that challenge and the growth and development, we know challenge is necessary for growth. And yet that can be the things that a lot of kids these days opt out of because of many of the reasons you've mentioned, like that fear of failure, that felt
Mhm.
need to be perfect. How do you train choosing challenge? Like if you're
Mm.
working with an individual athlete, separate from awareness or maybe in combination with, like, how do you work with them to the point where they are proactively choosing challenge versus making choices that avoid situations where they may experience failure?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love that. So how do you help them choose challenge? It comes back to the nervous system. Now, why wouldn't they choose challenge? They wouldn't choose challenge because they're threatened by challenge. Why would they be threatened by challenge? Because of what that challenge, the consequence of that challenge would mean. So, right, they're risking failure. So, what that failure means is I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, I'm horrible, I'm terrible, right? I'm this, I'm that. So if that's the kind of pathway you're setting up, then yeah, I'm not going to choose that either, right? No matter how kind of maybe much the coach is telling me to do or parents are telling me to do that, I don't want to risk, essentially not existing because I failed and now that means I'm not enough and everybody hates me. So it's really, and this is the work I do individually. And again, this is tough, right? I already hear the coaches in my head of like, but I have a team. At the same time, like so much of this is wrapped up in the individual psychology of players, and it is a lot of similarities across, this generation. And so the work I do is helping them with their core beliefs. So, rather than like I have to be perfect, challenging that, restructuring that, reframing that, and then hopefully, right, they're starting to adopt of like what does that have to be perfect mean in the sense of basketball? Well, I want to be better. Okay, you want to be better. That's great. We're moving in the right direction. Let's get really clear and specific. And so then just really detailing that out, because what we have here is unrealistic expectations. So if I'm an athlete and I have this perfectionism, you kind of grounded inside of me, then it's going to foster unrealistic expectations, and pressure comes from expectations. And so if I have unrealistic expectations, I'm going to have unnecessary pressure, and then I'm stacking the cards against me. So I'm putting this pathway before me where, okay, well, now I don't even want to try or don't even want to play or put myself out there because the risk is too much. Because if I fail, then that means I'm horrible, and it kind of feeds back into itself. And so for me, it's about really working at the ground level, the core level, which is the beliefs, and then from the beliefs, fostering realistic expectations, and then from there, working on self-talk and things like that. And so that's kind of my process of how to help them on an individual basis. But it really is helping their nervous system switch from survival mode into play mode. And so, in order for that to happen, we need to stop seeing things as threats and what I have to lose and, how this could be horrible for me. into I'm playing, here are opportunities to grow, right? Challenge isn't a threatening thing, but it's actually a really awesome thing. It's a thing that I now want to approach instead of avoid. Um, and so, yeah, there's a lot there. I could go in a bunch of different directions, but that's kind of at the core of my approach, is to look at their beliefs, their expectations, their self-talk in that order, and help them establish a healthier way forward to where now they're activating that play mode instead of survival mode, which means they're going to approach challenges rather than avoid
That's awesome. Thank you.
them.
David, if many coaches here are going, okay, a lot of good stuff, boy. Where do I start? Do I need to get the PhD? And yet, I know like your model, and you're really good at simplifying these in your book and in some of your materials online. What are the three, if coaches could just go improve, get better at three things, what would you say are the three most important things that a coach should, or what could be with three most important things that a coach could go work on to better help their Gen Z athletes, from this psychological approach?
Sure. Yeah, so we've talked about breathing a lot. I think it's the lowest hanging fruit, right? Something we do 20,000 times a day at least, and we don't really think about it. So even just instituting a breathing practice for you as a coach, because so many coaches I know, especially at the high school level, right? They're teaching all day. Talk about kids being dysregulated, coaches dysregulated. You have to deal with so much. You have to wear so many different hats. Like it is such a difficult job and very challenging. And so even that shift of going into practice mode from kind of last period, or now going into a game from family life, like there's so many little transitional moments. So whether you're in the car or you're walking the hallway, just having some breathing practice for yourself to help kind of regulate your own system, and then establishing a breathing practice for your team that you're doing with them, so it's helping everybody. And so a breathing practice would be one. I'm huge on language, and so again, kind of coming back to this idea, and I'm sure people disagree with it, which is fine, but that idea of like demanding language of like you have to do this, or you ought, or you should have done that, even switching that language to I want you to do this, right? Or I prefer if you do this, or I'd like if you did that. Like that language now doesn't hold the same weight. And it also opens up doors for options and autonomy, because the reality is like we don't have all the answers as coaches. And there's not just one way to do something, especially when you're, teaching like, coaching skill acquisition. How Reggie Miller shot and Ray Allen shot, Steve Nash shot, like those are all very different people and all very different forms of shooting. So there's not one particular right way, and we know the right way. Rather, it opens up the options and it's more exploratory, which is more back to the playful thing. And now they're approaching rather than avoiding. They're trying to find the way that works for them the best rather than trying to adopt your way all the time, which is going to lead to avoidance and dysregulations a lot of times. So the language is huge, shifting from that demanding language to kind of that preferential language, which opens up options. You're still challenging them and calling them forward, but it's more supportive and guiding. And then I would say the third one um, is expressions. So your expressions as a coach, being more mindful of your expressions, right? Even your facial gestures and expressions, like we call them micro expressions, like are we smiling? Are we sending signals of welcoming and safety? Because the nervous system is scanning and your players are scanning and looking around for safety. And so, can that find that safety for you? Because if their nervous system doesn't feel safe, they're not going to be able to do what you're asking them to do. The nervous system needs to feel safe enough to do what you're asking them to do. And so, sending those signals and gestures and coordinating that within the team with the high fives and stuff, but then also from us as coaches to be able to smile and show encouragement and not just look disappointed and frustrated and angry. So those expressions, and with those expressions, I would say affirmations. I know y'all talk about this too, but the not instead of just like praising outcomes, right? Affirming the behaviors, tending to the causes that lead to the outcomes we want. So affirming the focus that they have, the little things in the process, rather than always highlighting the outcomes, which are already too much on their brain. So really helping them shift that awareness to the process and the things that are in their control. So affirmations are huge. Hey, I like how you focus there. I loved how you set that screen. You're nice and sturdy. I know that you didn't get the outcome you wanted. Keep doing those little things. The big things are going to happen. Things like that. Talking them through that. So I would say breathing's a low-hanging fruit, shifting that language from demanding to preferential, open up some options, and then expressions, making sure we're expressing signs of safety and welcoming, and affirmations is a good way to do that verbally.
Those are great. I mean, just I think everyone can smile a little bit more,
Yeah.
breathe a little bit deeper,
Yeah.
and just be a little kinder in how we talk to people. And a little like the amount of times I used to be like, "You can't keep turning the ball over," or "Stop turning the ball over," and just demanding
Right.
that of my players like that. Have really helped. So yeah, be a little kinder, smile a little bit more, breathe a little bit deeper. These are great suggestions, David. Thanks for coming to the podcast. Where can coaches go deeper, learn more about your psychological approach to working with today's athletes?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me. And realdevelopment.org is my website. I don't have any social media or anything, so you can just kind of find everything there. On Amazon, you can find the book, Bet on It. And so, yeah, those two have my work number there and email. Would love to just continue the conversation and talk with anybody. Sometimes it's difficult on a podcast or, as y'all know, just like a general format because things are so personalized, things are so individualized to particular coaches and situations and sports and gender and diversity factors. Like there's so many different things there. It's very complex and nuanced, and no, I don't have all the answers, but I'm a nerd and I love this stuff and I love talking about it. So even just exploring and co-creating and collaborating, these are the things I love to do. So please reach out. I would love to talk with anybody about kind of what their coaching is looking like right now, and some possible ways to help and support, and bring some value. So I appreciate y'all having me on and this opportunity to connect with your community and audience. And yeah, I'm excited for the conversations that come forth.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode and for our interview with David Durand. If you haven't already, be sure to check him out and his book, Bet on It. Okay. If you found this episode valuable, you might want to check out the coaching notes, not just for the summary of the points, but in our coaching notes, we put together an action plan of like action items for you to consider. You get those coaching notes by going to tocculture.com and subscribing to the weekly culture toolbox. Thanks again for listening into the Coaching Culture Podcast. If you haven't already, please leave us a review and share these episodes when you find them valuable.